The Two Lives of Lawrence Bader. Akron, Ohio, 1957. A city forged in the stern grip of industry, where faith anchored every soul and routine was the unwavering pulse of life. In this landscape of predictable tomorrows lived Lawrence Joseph Bader, a man on the cusp of welcoming his fourth child into a world that, for him, was about to shatter. On the mild morning of May 15th, a Wednesday like countless others, he pressed a farewell kiss upon his wife's lips. "Cleveland for business," he'd said, "and perhaps some fishing on Lake Erie afterwards." The words, mundane at the time, would echo with an unnerving resonance through the years. The next day, the lake surrendered his empty boat. It drifted ashore, miraculously intact, save for a single missing oar and a tank drained of fuel. No struggle, no sign of capsizing, just the vessel of a vanished man. How could a life evaporate so utterly, leaving behind only a name and a family condemned to perpetual waiting? Akron was a working town, built on the bedrock of honest labor and a fierce pride in its own steadfastness. The shadows of war had long receded, replaced by the industrious thrum of factories. Families wove their existence around the comforting threads of small routines. The scent of morning coffee, the quiet reverence of Sunday church, the ceaseless hum of machinery that sculpted the American middle class. Life here did not rush. People toiled, raised their children, and held an unspoken covenant with tomorrow, trusting it would mirror today. Among these ordinary lives was Lawrence Joseph Bader, a 30-year-old salesman known to his neighbors simply as Larry. Born in Akron on December 2nd, 1926, he had returned to these familiar, quiet streets after serving in the U.S. Navy during World War II. Friends remembered him as friendly, articulate, and inherently good-natured, a man capable of selling anything, for he truly seemed to believe in its worth.
For years, he had crisscrossed northern Ohio as a cookware salesman for the Reynolds Metals Corporation, demonstrating gleaming aluminum kitchenware to department stores and homemakers. At home, a devoted wife, Mary Lou Knapp, and 3 children awaited him, with the 4th on its way. Their life, though not lavish, was respectable: a modest house, a dependable car, and a future that felt safely charted. Larry cherished his family, found satisfaction in his work, and in the quiet evenings sometimes practiced archery in the backyard, a lingering skill from his Navy days. It was one of the few pursuits that seemed to calm the restless currents beneath his composed surface. For beneath that surface, the numbers told a different story. Bader owed a staggering $20,000, a labyrinth of taxes, loans, and other debts. In 1957, this sum was the equivalent of over $220,000 today, a crushing weight that few spoke of openly. Yet those closest to him knew the burden was immense. The Internal Revenue Service was hot on his heels, letters of demand arriving with chilling regularity. Still, Larry displayed no outward signs of panic or breakdown. He was the kind of man who could wear a smile, even when the world pressed down hardest. The morning of May 15, 1957, dawned with a gentle, partly cloudy sky, a quintessential spring day in northern Ohio. Lawrence Bader informed Mary Lou of his Cleveland appointment and his intention to fish Lake Erie afterward. He kissed her goodbye, promised to return that evening, and drove away in his company car. It was the last time she would ever see the man she knew. Later that morning, Bader arrived at the Bayboat Sales Marina near Rocky River, just west of Cleveland. The marina's owner, whose testimony would later surface in various accounts, described him as cheerful and relaxed. He rented a 14-foot aluminum boat, paid in cash, and casually mentioned he'd stay near the shore. The owner, a seasoned lake veteran, warned of rough winds predicted for later that day. Bader simply nodded, offered a placid assurance of caution, and pushed off into the vast, gray expanse of the lake. That afternoon, the sky curdled. Strong northerly winds roared across the water, whipping the surface into a frenzy of whitecaps. The small boat vanished from sight before nightfall. When it failed to return by closing time, the marina operator assumed the renter had found another dock or simply waited out the sudden tempest. By morning, with no word, the Coast Guard was alerted. At dawn, a patrolman spotted the small aluminum boat adrift near Perkins Beach, barely 5 miles from its launch. The hull bore minor damage along one side, and a single oar was conspicuously absent. Inside, a life jacket lay unused, a tackle box sat undisturbed, and the gas tank was nearly empty. No signs of foul play, no discarded clothing, not a single footprint marred the sand nearby.
The discovery was a riddle. The lake had calmed overnight, and the boat's condition hardly suggested a violent capsizing. If Bader had fallen overboard, why was his life jacket still meticulously folded? A frantic search of the shoreline yielded nothing. No wallet, no papers, not even a forgotten hat. His car remained precisely where he'd left it, near the marina, locked, a silent monument to his inexplicable absence. Back in Akron, Mary Lou endured a day of agonizing waiting, clinging to the hope of a phone call. By evening, the Cleveland police delivered the chilling news. Her husband's boat had been found empty. No evidence of injury or drowning, they reported, unable to offer any explanation for the void he had left. In the official incident log, a stark summary was etched. Boat recovered, Perkins Beach, minor damage, 1 oar missing, life jacket present, fuel exhausted, occupant unaccounted for. The Coast Guard launched an immediate search operation across the western edge of Lake Erie, but the relentless winds and currents hampered their efforts. Days bled into one another, yet no body emerged from the frigid depths. The search was eventually scaled back. Officers were left to ponder: had the missing man drowned, suffered a tragic accident, or simply walked away? For those who knew Lawrence Bader, such an act seemed unthinkable. He was not a man of reckless risks. He had a wife, children, a stable job, and friends who remembered him as methodical, almost cautious. The profound lack of evidence left only a deafening silence. News rippled quickly through Akron. Local salesmen missing on Lake Erie. Colleagues at Reynolds Metals exchanged bewildered glances. Some whispered of a misjudgment of the storm. Others, more quietly, wondered if he had chosen not to return. Such speculation remained private. Officially, the case was logged as a missing person. Mary Lou, a fortress of composure, clung to the rituals of her grief. She answered the police's questions, then the Coast Guard's, repeating the same details until the words lost all meaning. His habits, his debts, their final exchange. Each night she waited by the phone. Each morning, the news remained unchanged. No trace, no witnesses. For the investigators, the file remained stubbornly thin. No motive for foul play, no physical evidence pointing to suicide, no financial transactions suggesting a planned escape. The boat, that small, unassuming 14-foot vessel, was the sole tangible artifact left behind, silent, unhelpful. Days bled into weeks. The vast waters of Lake Erie offered no confession. Years later, a Coast Guard report would encapsulate the entire enigma in a single, chilling line. Boat recovered, occupant missing, presumed drowned. The stark simplicity of the sentence belied its immense weight. For his family, it marked the genesis of an agonizing, unending uncertainty. For the official record, it closed a chapter without truly solving the puzzle. And from that day forward, Lawrence Joseph Bader, was gone. The morning after the small aluminum boat was found adrift near Perkins Beach, the news spread like a cold front across Cleveland and back to Akron. A local salesman had vanished on Lake Erie, a body of water notorious for its sudden, violent squalls and its deceptively quiet, frigid depths. At first glance, the report seemed tragically ordinary. Men were lost to those waters every year. But for the seasoned investigators, a dissonant chord resonated within this particular case. The U.S. Coast Guard launched its first official search at dawn on May 16, 1957. 3 patrol boats sliced through the steel-gray surface, their engines a muted thrum against the morning stillness. A spotter plane circled lazily overhead, its keen eyes scouring the churning waters for any debris, any movement, any sign. On shore, volunteers walked the sandy stretches from Rocky River eastward, dragging the shallows with heavy grappling hooks. Search dogs, their noses to the ground, were brought in, hoping to catch a lingering scent from the recovered boat. Nothing. No body, no discarded clothing, not even the faintest sheen of oil or fuel upon the water. The lake that day, having spent its fury, was calm, almost unnervingly clear. Officers noted that under such conditions, a drowning victim would normally surface within hours. A senior investigator, years later, would confide to the Akron Beacon-Journal, "If he went into the lake, we should have found him. Men don't just disappear out there." Yet, that was precisely what had occurred. For the first grueling week, the search remained intensive. Coast Guard units expanded their perimeter 20 miles along the shoreline. Air patrols crisscrossed the entire western basin of the lake. Every fisherman, every boat owner who had ventured out that day was meticulously interviewed. Not one had witnessed a man in distress or a capsized vessel. The only piece of solid evidence remained, that 14-foot aluminum boat, slightly dented, one oar missing, the life jacket still neatly folded in the stern. At the marina in Rocky River, the owner recounted the same story to each fresh-faced officer. Bader had arrived around 7:30 a.m., cheerful, in remarkably good spirits. He had paid cash, courteously declined the offer of an additional life jacket, and promised to stay close to shore. "I warned him a blow was coming in off the lake," the man recalled to Discovery UK, "but he didn't seem worried. Said he'd be back by late afternoon." This casual dismissal of the weather report troubled investigators. On that very morning, the National Weather Service had issued an advisory for strong winds and choppy waters, conditions that would typically keep most small craft firmly docked. Yet Bader had ventured out, alone, without informing anyone of his precise destination. Meanwhile, in Akron, Mary Lou Bader was enveloped by the hollow silence of waiting. Each day brought a fresh phone call, another form to sign, another flicker of hope that quickly guttered into nothingness. During the first week, she drove to Cleveland, spoke with the officers, and walked the very beach where the boat had been found. She recognized his fishing gear instantly, the worn leather handle of the tackle box, the faint LJB scratched near the clasp. But of the man himself there was no trace. As the days stretched on, the tone of the investigation subtly shifted. The urgent pursuit of rescue yielded to the methodical routine of recovery. By the second week, Coast Guard divers were assigned only to targeted zones near the harbor. Missing, presumed drowned began to appear with chilling regularity in the official paperwork. Yet small, insistent details refused to conform to this neat narrative. In the days preceding his disappearance, Bader had quietly withdrawn $400 in cash, roughly a month's salary, from his bank account. He had also settled several overdue bills and written 2 personal checks to clear minor debts. Individually, these actions seemed unremarkable, but when placed alongside his sudden vanishing, they unsettled investigators.
If a man intended to disappear, one officer remarked later, he would have taken that money with him. But the cash was never traced. It vanished as completely as Bader himself, never appearing in any subsequent transactions under his name. By June 1957, the Coast Guard suspended its search. The file was transferred to the Ohio State Police for administrative closure. Reporters penned their final summaries: a responsible man lost to a sudden storm, leaving behind a wife and 3 small children. The final entry in the Coast Guard log read simply, "Boat recovered, occupant unlocated."
For Mary Lou, bureaucracy became the next relentless storm. Without a body, there could be no death certificate, no life insurance payment, no legal clarity. Bills arrived as before, but now on a single, strained income. The IRS sent another daunting notice concerning her husband's back taxes, debts that, unlike the man himself, did not simply vanish. Each letter served as a cruel reminder. Whatever had transpired on that lake, the world still demanded answers. By the close of 1957, public interest had predictably waned. Akron was not a city given to lingering on mysteries. Newspapers turned to fresh headlines, local politics, sports, the exciting prospect of a new interstate highway. To most, the name Lawrence Bader disappeared as quietly as the man himself. But in the Bader household, his absence filled every room like a suffocating shroud. The children grew. The 4th child was born, and Mary Lou, with a quiet strength, did her best to maintain the steady rhythm their father had left behind. Friends described her as composed, even stoic, but the gnawing uncertainty was a constant torment. "I could accept it if he were gone," she once confided to a cousin, "but how do you grieve for someone who might walk in the door tomorrow?" 3 years crawled by. Eventually, the law provided its own stark form of closure. In 1960, under Ohio state provisions for missing persons, Mary Lou was legally declared a widow. The life insurance policy on her husband finally paid out after formal certification of death, and she began receiving monthly Social Security survivor benefits, $254 a month, as later reported by Mental Floss. It was enough to sustain the family, though the looming shadow of his debts and unpaid taxes never truly dissipated. She was only in her early 30s, raising 4 children alone. The police closed the file with a single administrative phrase: "Case inactive, body not recovered." To the investigators, it was another statistic, another unfortunate accident swallowed by the lake. To the family, it was a wound sealed, but never truly healed. And yet, beyond the quiet confines of Ohio, life continued in ways no one could have possibly imagined. Only a few days after the search for Lawrence Bader ceased, nearly 600 miles away in Omaha, Nebraska, a man stepped into a neighborhood bar. He called himself John Fritz Johnson. Friendly, charismatic, he claimed to have just arrived in town looking for work. Within weeks, he was perched atop a flagpole for a charity fundraiser, a flamboyant stunt that drew local attention and earned him his enduring nickname, Fritz.
At the time, no one connected the names. The news from distant Ohio had long faded by the time Nebraska papers printed stories about the cheerful man on the flagpole. To everyone in Omaha, Fritz Johnson was simply a new face with an easy laugh and an infectious taste for adventure. Back in Akron, Mary Lou never heard of him. She poured her energy into her children, her job, her unwavering faith. The years crept forward. By the time reporters sporadically revisited the Bader case, it was already dissolving into the realm of forgotten memories, another unsolved disappearance filed away in the quiet archives of the Midwest. And so the case remained. An empty boat, a missing man, a family left to mourn a phantom. After months of fruitless searching, the file was quietly marked closed. The lake had kept its secret, and the hope that once stirred in every search report slowly dissolved into the vast silence. For 8 long years, the name Lawrence Joseph Bader existed only in the yellowing files of the Akron Police Department. By 1960, his wife, Mary Lou, had navigated every agonizing legal procedure to have him declared dead. The lake had yielded nothing. No body, no trace, no confession. Insurance payouts were made, tax files closed. The crushing weight of his debts folded into silence. All that remained of him were a handful of photographs. A young man, smiling in his Navy uniform, standing beside a car he could no longer afford. The late 1950s gave way to a new decade, an America brimming with television sets, burgeoning suburban growth, and an infectious optimism. But for Mary Lou and her children, the 1960s dawned without him. She raised 4 children alone, eventually remarried in a quiet defiance of grief, and never spoke of Lake Erie unless directly asked. To the world, the story had concluded. It hadn't. While Ohio moved on, nearly 600 miles away in Omaha, Nebraska, a vibrant new figure emerged. He was tall, full of life, and always irrevocably performing. He called himself John Fritz Johnson, a man defined by flamboyant humor and relentless energy. Locals first encountered him at the Round Table Bar in 1957, mere days after Bader had vanished, claiming to be from everywhere and nowhere. No one questioned him. Omaha was the kind of place where people came to start anew.
Within months, Fritz became a minor celebrity. His inaugural stunt was audacious even for the era. He volunteered to sit atop a flagpole for 30 days to raise money for polio research. He accomplished it with a beaming smile, joking effortlessly with reporters, earning local fame for his peculiar blend of charm and eccentricity. Soon, he was hired as a bartender, then a radio announcer, and eventually promoted to sports director at KETV Channel 7. He possessed an innate instinct for performance, a magnetism that drew people into his orbit. His booming laugh, the distinctive eye patch he wore after losing an eye to cancer in 1964, and his habit of driving a converted hearse, a macabre black vehicle lined with pillows and burning incense, which he affectionately dubbed his hunting car, made him unforgettable. Those who met him described him as magnetic yet fiercely private. He rarely spoke of his past, claiming to have grown up all over the place, a line that seemed harmless at the time but would later become a crucial clue. In 1961, he married Nancy Zimmer, a 20-year-old divorcee. To her, he was generous, gloriously unpredictable, and deeply human, a man who loved archery, fine cigars, and radio music. They had a son together. He was well liked in Omaha, known for his eccentric humor and his ability to imbue ordinary moments with theatrical flair. By all appearances, John Fritz Johnson was entirely, unequivocally real. But in February 1965, in Chicago, these two disparate worlds, one declared dead, the other vibrantly alive, collided. That week, Fritz was working as an archery demonstrator at a sporting goods convention. He was showcasing bows, arrows, and techniques to an engrossed crowd when a young woman stopped abruptly in her tracks. Her name was Suzanne Pecaw, and she was the niece of Lawrence Bader from Akron. She watched him for several minutes, a growing certainty chilling her, before whispering to her companion, "That's my Uncle Larry." The man before her was older, heavier, adorned with an eye patch and a neatly trimmed mustache. But the voice, the posture, the very way he bantered with strangers, it was unmistakable. Still, disbelief held her captive. After the demonstration, she approached him, her voice trembling slightly. "Pardon me," she asked politely, "but aren't you my Uncle Larry who disappeared 7 years ago?" Fritz laughed, a hearty, disarming sound. "Young lady," he replied, I wish I had an uncle like that. But no, I'm John Johnson from Omaha.
Suzanne left shaken, but far from convinced. The next day, she returned, fortified by the presence of her two brothers. They confronted him again, pointing out the uncanny similarities, even producing an old photograph. The resemblance was undeniable. Fritz, however, continued his steadfast denials, insisting he had never set foot in Ohio, that his life had begun years earlier somewhere out west. But when the brothers pressed further, proposing a fingerprint comparison, he offered no resistance. "Do what you like," he said with a shrug, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. Days later, the prints returned from the military archive. They matched. The man in Omaha, the television personality, the father, the community fundraiser, was unequivocally Lawrence Joseph Bader, the cookware salesman who had vanished on Lake Erie in 1957. The news ripped through both families like a slow, agonizing explosion. In Akron, Mary Lou collapsed when she saw the photograph splashed across the newspaper. "It's him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'd know that smile anywhere." Her children, old enough now to recall fragments, a strong hand lifting them, the comforting scent of pipe tobacco, found the miracle profoundly cruel. Their father was alive, yet he belonged to someone else. In Omaha, the revelation tore through the local community. KETV reporters were stunned. Their colleague, the man who had worked beside them for years, was now the epicenter of a national story. Nancy, his wife, initially refused to believe it. "My husband isn't that man," she insisted to the police. "He's Fritz. He's always been Fritz." But fingerprints, those immutable markers of identity, left no room for argument. The past had found him. Fritz himself seemed dazed. Confronted with the irrefutable evidence, he reportedly said, "It's like a door slammed shut and hit me in the face. Until that moment, I was certain I wasn't that man. Now I don't know." Yet, even as the truth enveloped him, he stubbornly refused to accept it. To every reporter, every investigator, he repeated the same unwavering line: "I'm not Larry Bader. I don't remember being that man. I don't remember any of it." The emotional fallout was immense, a tsunami of conflicting truths. For one family, it was the resurrection of someone long buried. For the other, it was the abrupt erasure of the person they loved. Mary Lou's long-held grief mutated into a bewildering confusion. Should she rejoice or feel profoundly betrayed? Nancy's unwavering devotion was brutally tested by the realization that her marriage, in the eyes of the law, was null and void. The children of both households faced a ghost who lived, spoke, and denied them all. The story captivated American households, unfolding as one of the strangest true cases ever recorded. For the authorities, it was a cold case that had thawed too late. No crime, no suspect, no body, yet infinite damage. For the public, it was a narrative that blurred the delicate boundary between disappearance and rebirth. Reporters filled the silence with a torrent of speculation. Was it a deliberate escape? A rare total amnesia? A nervous breakdown disguised as reinvention? Each proposed answer carried both pity and judgment. But for those caught in its agonizing grasp, the reality was simpler and infinitely more painful. A man who had vanished in a haze of debt and confusion had reappeared in another life, built love and laughter around himself, only to have it all painstakingly dismantled by a few irrefutable fingerprints. When the police finally closed the file, they scrawled in neat black ink, "Subject located, case concluded." But for everyone who had known him, by one name or the other, the case was anything but concluded. And as Fritz sat before the television cameras that spring, his expression distant, the room heavy with unspoken truths, he whispered a single sentence that would define the rest of his fractured life.
I don't know who I am. In February 1965, the story erupted like a sudden storm across America. United Press International, with a flair for the dramatic, ran the headline, "The Strange Case of John Fritz Johnson." Within hours, it was picked up by newspapers from coast to coast. Readers who vaguely recalled the small item published 8 years earlier, Akron salesman missing on Lake Erie, now saw his name again, this time beside a photograph of a man with an eye patch, a wide grin, and a microphone in hand. The very notion was almost impossible to grasp. A man presumed dead for 7 years had resurfaced under a new identity, living a second life as a local celebrity. No murder, no elaborate fraud ring, no grand conspiracy, just a man miraculously alive with no memory of who he once was. When federal authorities confirmed the irrefutable fingerprint match between Lawrence Joseph Bader and John Francis Fritz Johnson, the case transformed into both a legal and psychological labyrinth. The man himself seemed as utterly bewildered as anyone else. He said, "It's like I was hit by lightning," he told reporters, his voice tinged with a disorienting sincerity. "Until that moment, I had no doubt who I was. Now I don't know what to think." For weeks, the story dominated talk shows and front pages. Every journalist had a theory. Some whispered amnesia, others suggested a meticulously planned hoax. To the public, it was both tragedy and spectacle. The lost man who lived twice.
Authorities swiftly arranged for a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation, a 10-day ordeal. A team of specialists from the University of Nebraska Medical Center observed him around the clock. Their findings were cautious, yet compelling. Subject exhibits no recollection of previous identity. Displays consistent memory structure beginning approximately 8 years prior. No conscious deception detectable. Translated from clinical language, it meant this: if he was lying, he was an extraordinary, unparalleled liar. If he was telling the truth, he was one of the rarest amnesiac cases ever documented. Doctors could not definitively determine whether the memory loss was psychogenic, caused by profound emotional trauma, or organic, a result of physical damage to the brain. But one fact, though not conclusive, captured their attention. In 1964, a year before his rediscovery, Johnson had been diagnosed with a malignant tumor behind his left eye. Surgeons had removed the eye to save his life, but the tumor's precarious position, close to the temporal lobe, could theoretically have affected memory and identity. The theory remained unproven, a tantalizing, unfinished equation hanging over the case. Meanwhile, a cascade of legal chaos began for Mary Lou Bader in Akron. The phone calls were ceaseless. Her husband, the man she had buried in paperwork and grief, was alive. This should have been a moment of unbridled joy, but reality proved far crueler. She had been legally declared a widow, received $39,500 in life insurance benefits, and accepted monthly Social Security payments for years. Now, with his reappearance, she risked being charged with wrongful collection, despite her utter innocence. "It's like he died twice," a family friend lamented to the Akron Beacon-Journal. "Once on the lake and once in the papers." Her private life also imploded into utter confusion. In the Catholic Church, her marriage to Bader had automatically resumed upon his reappearance, rendering null and void any future marriage she might have pursued. She was preparing to remarry, a relative recalled, and suddenly she's a wife again, to a man who doesn't even remember her name. On the other side of the Midwest, in Omaha, Nebraska, Nancy Zimmer faced an equally impossible nightmare. She was legally married to Fritz Johnson, the man she had loved fiercely for years, the father of her child. Now, the courts informed her that their marriage was null and void.
Her husband, they explained, was not Fritz Johnson at all, but Lawrence J. Bader, who had never been legally divorced. When reporters, eager for drama, asked Nancy if she would leave him, her reply was simple, imbued with unwavering loyalty. "He's still the man I know. I'll stand by him." The American legal system had no precedent for such an unprecedented situation. Which name was valid? Which marriage stood? Who owned his property, his debts, his insurance benefits, his tax liabilities? Every answer hinged on the fundamental question of who the man in the eye patch truly was. And the one person who could resolve it simply stated with calm certainty, "I don't remember being anyone else."
During an interview with Life magazine, Johnson appeared calm yet utterly bewildered. "I have a whole set of memories," he explained, "and none of them include Akron or Mary Lou or the Navy. I know about Omaha. I know about Nancy. But when they tell me I'm someone else, I can't make it fit." To some observers, that statement carried the unsettling rhythm of guilt, a man meticulously inventing an alibi so elaborate it sounded sincere. To others, it was the haunted honesty of someone desperately trapped between two irreconcilable lives. Psychologists found themselves split evenly. Half believed it was dissociative amnesia, possibly triggered by the crushing weight of debt, stress, or trauma. The other half leaned towards deliberate escape, a man reinventing himself under the most convenient cover story imaginable. After all, he had been facing severe IRS trouble and substantial debts when he vanished. Yet the details of his disappearance did not neatly align with premeditation. If he had planned to vanish, why rent a boat under his own name? Why leave behind personal items, a drained fuel tank, and no tangible evidence of departure? And how had he constructed a new identity within days, hundreds of miles away, with no known associates or forged documents? Law enforcement quietly acknowledged what the psychiatrists had already concluded. The mystery might never be truly solved. By the summer of 1965, public fascination began to wane, replaced by the tedious march of procedural paperwork. The IRS reopened its old case against Bader, though lawyers quickly determined it was unenforceable. The man they were charging technically no longer existed at the time the debts were incurred. His insurance company demanded repayment of the $39,500 paid to Mary Lou. She protested fiercely, but the law was unambiguous. Every path of inquiry, medical, legal, moral, led into the same impenetrable fog. Was this truly an act of profound amnesia? Or had Lawrence Bader staged the most convincing, elaborate disappearance of his era? The unsettling presence of the tumor behind his eye added a cruel layer of ambiguity. Neurologists conceded that its growth could indeed have damaged memory centers in the brain, potentially erasing prior identity. But skeptics countered that the tumor had developed years after his disappearance. Without early medical records, no one could definitively prove cause or effect. By the time the press finally lost interest, 2 women had effectively lost their husbands, 4 children had lost their father, and 1 man had lost the very certainty of his own name.
In the end, the file that had begun as a simple missing persons report had morphed into a profound philosophical riddle. Where does a man's identity truly reside? In his memory, in his fingerprints, or in the eyes of those who remember him? And so the question hung unanswered, suspended precariously between cold fact and unwavering faith. Was John Fritz Johnson truly a man reborn, or merely Lawrence Bader pretending not to remember the life he had so deliberately abandoned? The case had entered a gray zone that law could not define and science could not fully explain. By the time 1966 arrived, the convoluted case of Lawrence Joseph Bader, or John Fritz Johnson, had transcended mere curiosity. It had become a profound riddle that neither law nor medicine could definitively solve, blurring the very boundaries between truth, identity, and intent. Reporters had ceased asking where he had been. They were now asking who he had ever been at all. In the months following his astounding rediscovery, investigators, psychologists, and journalists alike grappled to explain what had truly transpired on Lake Erie that fateful day in May 1957. Three main theories emerged, each with its ardent believers and equally fervent skeptics. The first theory, perhaps the most compassionate, and yet in many ways the most improbable, posited true amnesia. In this version, Bader had gone fishing that afternoon, suffered a sudden traumatic blow to the head, or experienced some profound psychological episode, causing him to lose all memory of his former life. Disoriented and stripped of his past, he wandered away from the lake, unconsciously adopted a new name, and simply began again. The medical community could not entirely dismiss it. There were documented cases of fugue states, in which individuals under immense psychological stress would abandon their old lives and construct entirely new ones, with no conscious awareness of their past identities. The psychiatrists who meticulously examined him noted no discernible signs of deception. His responses, reflexes, and emotional reactions were consistent with a genuine dissociative condition.
The second theory was far more cynical, that Bader had deliberately faked his own death to escape his crippling debts. At the precise moment he vanished, he owed the government over $20,000, a truly crushing sum for a traveling salesman. He was also behind on several personal loans, and creditors were beginning to circle like vultures. Disappearing into the vast expanse of Lake Erie, leaving behind an empty boat and no body, could have been the perfect, meticulously orchestrated exit. Supporters of this theory pointed to his last known actions: withdrawing $400 in cash, carefully paying off small debts to tidy his ledger, and heading towards a large lake just as severe weather was approaching. If he had indeed planned a disappearance, those choices fit the pattern with unsettling precision. Yet this second theory, too, had its significant flaws. There was no evidence whatsoever that Bader had arranged an alternate identity beforehand. No forged papers, no meticulously laid false trail. Fritz Johnson appeared in Omaha within days, seemingly fully formed, but with no known connections to anyone there. And if he had escaped to begin anew, why do so in such a conspicuously public manner? Few fugitives would volunteer to spend a month sitting atop a flagpole, photographed by every local newspaper. The risk of recognition was enormous. His entire second life, ironically, was lived under a far brighter spotlight than his first. The third theory, favored by many modern analysts, suggested a combination of both. Perhaps Bader had fled intentionally, only to suffer a profound psychological break that genuinely erased part of his memory, thus anchoring him irrevocably in the fiction he had created. This would explain both the meticulous early steps, settling bills, withdrawing cash, and the utterly convincing sincerity with which Fritz denied ever being Bader. This hybrid hypothesis attempted to bridge the chasm between outright fraud and genuine tragedy. But even this theory faltered when confronted with the stark lack of concrete evidence. There were no witnesses placing him between Cleveland and Omaha, no trace of travel documents, bus tickets, or hotel registrations under any name. His timeline simply vanished for several bewildering days and then abruptly reappeared in a different state, hundreds of miles away. Between those 2 points lay a void that no one could ever fill. Legally, the situation was just as tangled. There was no crime to prosecute. No insurance fraud could be proven, as he himself had not filed a claim. No charge of bigamy could hold, since he did not knowingly marry two women, his memory of the first marriage being absent. The IRS could not indict him for evasion, as the dead man's tax file had already been officially closed. The law, meticulously built on definitions of intent and evidence, simply could not reach a man who existed under two names, but claimed to remember only one.
In Akron, Mary Lou's life was once again turned upside down. She was now neither widow nor wife. The insurance company aggressively demanded repayment of the $39,500 it had issued upon her husband's presumed death. The Social Security Administration immediately halted survivor payments. The Catholic Church advised that her marriage bond technically remained valid, but also acknowledged her husband's profound psychological absence. It was a cruel purgatory of paperwork and faith. In Omaha, Nancy Zimmer found herself in an equally impossible position. Her marriage to Fritz was declared void because he was, legally, another woman's husband. Yet the law also recognized that he had entered the union in good faith, genuinely believing himself unmarried. For a time, reporters, with a grim sense of irony, referred to her as the second widow. She told United Press International, "He's still the man I fell in love with. If he's someone else on paper, I can't help that." The legal confusion extended to property and taxes. The IRS determined that Fritz Johnson owed nothing prior to 1957, but that Lawrence Bader still had significant unresolved debt. The absurd result was that one man's identity was deep in debt, while the other's was perfectly solvent. Lawyers for both families agreed that there was no legal precedent in U.S. history to guide them through this unprecedented morass. The psychiatric report from the University of Nebraska remained the sole formal assessment of the man at the center of it all. It concluded, subject presents as two distinct identity continuums, the latter entirely unaware of the former. No evidence of deliberate fabrication detected. Further study inconclusive. Public fascination continued to swirl, though the man himself seemed utterly exhausted by it all. When reporters asked whether he now accepted that he was Lawrence Bader, he simply shook his head. "I don't know who that man is," he said, his voice flat with weariness. "I know who I am, John Francis Johnson. If you say he and I are the same, I can't help you, but I can't believe it." Even after the irrefutable fingerprint match, he never once used the name Bader again. To colleagues at KETV, he remained Fritz, the one-eyed broadcaster with the booming laugh and the strangely compelling past. His insistence was so firm, so unyielding, that over time people simply stopped pressing the point.
And so, the law, constrained by its inherent need for clarity, reached its quiet, unsatisfying conclusion. There would be no trial, no definitive verdict, no official resolution. The case remained an administrative anomaly. A man declared dead in one state, yet vibrantly alive in another, guilty of nothing, yet responsible for the profound chaos that followed. It was, as Mental Floss later wrote, a story built on evidence that proved identity, but never intent. His fingerprints were irrefutable, his memories were not. The law could confirm his name, but not his mind. In the end, the files closed under a single echoing principle that resonated through every department that had touched the case. The law requires proof. This story had only doubt. And somewhere between the two, the man once called Lawrence Joseph Bader, known to half the nation as John Fritz Johnson, continued to live,
looking in the mirror each morning and whispering the only truth he believed: "I don't know who I am." When the astounding story of Lawrence Joseph Bader, known to half the nation as John Fritz Johnson, finally receded from the clamor of newspaper headlines, it did not vanish. Instead, it quietly transcended into another realm. Textbooks, legal discussions, and psychology lectures, where his bizarre double life became a pivotal case study, a haunting metaphor, and a cautionary tale. Psychiatrists cited it for decades afterward. In both clinical psychology and forensic psychiatry, it was taught as one of the most compelling, albeit perplexing, examples of a fugue state, a rare form of amnesia so complete that the sufferer unconsciously constructs an entirely new identity. But because no definitive medical proof ever fully confirmed that diagnosis, it simultaneously became an equally powerful example of an intentional reinvention, a psychological mask worn for so long that it became indistinguishable from the truth. In classrooms, it was famously labeled the Bader-Johnson paradox. Legal scholars repurposed his story for another purpose entirely. They passionately debated what the case revealed about the fundamental limits of law itself. What precisely happens when a person presumed legally dead suddenly returns? Does his debts revive with him? Do his marriages simply cancel each other out, or do they, in some bizarre legal sense, multiply? And if identity is irrefutably proven by fingerprints, but vehemently denied by memory, which side of the self does the law ultimately protect? The tangible body or the elusive mind? The insurance industry, shaken by the precedent, quietly rewrote portions of its policy language, adding new, meticulously crafted clauses specifically addressing the reappearance of the insured. Lawyers specializing in estate law began to cite the Bader anomaly whenever discussing the complex concepts of legal death and personal accountability. In those specialized circles, his story became far more than mere curiosity. It was a profound precedent. Yet the social impact transcended the confines of law. For ordinary Americans, reading about Bader's two distinct lives forced an uncomfortable, unsettling reflection. How fragile, truly, is the line between who we are and who we might irrevocably become? Could the crushing weight of debt, the paralyzing grip of fear, or the shattering force of trauma erase a man's past so completely that even he no longer recognized himself? Among neighbors in Akron and Omaha, reactions were sharply divided. Some felt a deep, empathetic sympathy. Maybe he really didn't know. Others were far harsher, unforgiving. A man who runs from his family doesn't deserve a second name. In that societal split, the case mirrored a timeless, agonizing debate between the demands of punishment and the complexities of understanding, between moral failure and the inherent fragility of the human spirit. When Bader/Johnson finally died in 1966, succumbing to the same malignant tumor that had claimed his eye, the swirling controversy finally ended in a profound silence. His funeral in Omaha was small, attended by colleagues and a handful of loyal friends. His grave bore the name John F. Johnson, the identity he chose, or perhaps the one that had chosen him. In Akron, Mary Lou did not attend. She told a reporter, her voice laced with years of layered grief, "That man died years ago. Whoever he became, I hope he found peace." In later years, the case continued to appear in countless studies and documentaries. Mental Floss, Discovery UK, and numerous academic papers revisited it as an enduring lesson in the nature of memory, ethics, and identity.
Students reading about it half a century later still ask the same unanswerable question that stumped their professors. Was he a cunning con man or a tragic casualty of his own shattered mind? More than a mere medical mystery, his story exposed something far deeper, the profound fragility of self. Between the terse lines of psychiatric reports and the convoluted legal filings was the poignant story of a man who might have run away from failure, or who might have simply forgotten who he was. Perhaps, in the agonizing gray zone of his existence, both were true. The moral that survived was neither condemnation nor absolution. It was a stark, resonant reminder. Every identity we carry, our names, our deaths, our loves, is built upon the bedrock of memory. And memory, for all its immense power, is not invincible. In the end, what remains is a question that no fingerprint, no diagnosis, no verdict could ever definitively settle. Who was he truly? Was he Lawrence Bader, the salesman who vanished into a stormy lake? Or Fritz Johnson, the charismatic man who laughed behind an eye patch and lived as though he had never been lost? Decades later, the answer still drifts somewhere between the lake and the television studio, between the man who drowned and the one who woke up somewhere else. One man vanished, another took his place, and memory, that last elusive witness, refuses to tell the whole truth.
If you want to follow more true disappearance cases told through the lens of investigation and fact, subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this video. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Every story shared brings us one step closer to the truth.